I found the ticket inside an old coffee can in my husband's toolbox, tucked under a layer of rusted washers, like he didn't want anyone, not even himself, to look at it twice. When I finally understood what I was holding, I sat down on the concrete floor of our garage and didn't move for 11 minutes. Welcome to Kate's Fortune Stories. It's Kate again, and I'm so happy you're here with me. Before we begin, please subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. And tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. Don't forget to subscribe, because this story is only just beginning. My name is Renee Calloway, and for 19 years I thought I knew every corner of my own marriage. I want to tell you about the winter I learned that a man you've shared a bed with for 2 decades can still be a stranger holding a $9 million secret in a coffee can. Before any of this happened, my life had a rhythm to it. Steady, unremarkable, the kind of life nobody writes songs about. I was 47 years old, working as a hospice nurse at a home care agency in Tulsa, Oklahoma. I drove a 2016 Ford Escape with a check engine light that had been on so long I'd started to think of it as a personality trait rather than a warning. My husband, Walter Calloway, co-owned a small auto repair shop off Sheridan Road called Calloway and Pruitt, which he built from nothing with his college friend Dale Pruitt back when both of them were young enough to believe hard work solved everything. We lived in a modest brick ranch house in the Kendall Whittier neighborhood, the kind of house with a swing on the porch that squeaked in a way I'd grown fond of. We had 2 grown sons, Aiden and Cole, both out of the house, both doing fine, both calling on Sundays with the same predictable questions about whether I was eating enough vegetables. Our marriage wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the kind of love people write novels about either. It was quieter than that, built out of small routines, coffee made exactly the way the other person liked it, silence that didn't need filling, the particular comfort of falling asleep next to someone whose breathing you could recognize in the dark. I tell you all of this because I need you to understand what an ordinary Tuesday looked like in my house before the coffee can. I need you to understand what I lost the moment I opened it, and what I found underneath the loss, because it wasn't only money. It was something closer to the truth about the man I'd married. Walter's father, a man named Earl Calloway, had been a gambler. Not the charming, harmless kind you see in movies, but the kind who mortgaged a house twice without telling his wife, who disappeared for 3 days during Walter's 8th grade graduation because of a card game in Joplin, Missouri, that went sideways. Walter had grown up watching his mother count grocery money at the kitchen table with her hands shaking, and somewhere in that childhood, he had built a rule for himself, and later for us, that lottery tickets, scratch-offs, casino trips, any of it, were simply not something Calloways did. It wasn't a rule we discussed often. It was just understood, the way you understand not to touch a hot stove after you've been burned once as a child, except Walter had been burned by watching someone else get burned, which somehow made the rule even more absolute. That's why, when I found the ticket, my first feeling wasn't excitement. It was confusion, so total it felt almost like vertigo. It happened on a Tuesday in late October. I'd gone into the garage looking for a specific socket wrench because our bathroom faucet had started dripping, and I decided, in the stubborn way I sometimes decide things, that I could fix it myself before bothering Walter, who'd been working long hours at the shop and coming home more tired than I'd seen him in years. I pulled open his old rolling toolbox, the one with the sticker of a Sooners helmet on the side that had been peeling for a decade, and I saw, tucked behind the second drawer where he kept spare fuses and old receipts, a rusted coffee can with a plastic lid, the kind that used to hold Folgers back when we bought the big cans instead of the bags. I almost didn't open it. I want you to know that. I almost put it back exactly where it was and went looking for my wrench somewhere else, because some instinct, the same one that tells you not to read a text message over someone's shoulder, told me this was a place I hadn't been invited. But the can rattled when I moved it, a strange papery rattle, not metal, and curiosity, the The same curiosity that had made me a decent nurse for 23 years, that need to understand what's actually happening inside a body or a room or a marriage, won out. Inside, folded into a small paper envelope from a gas station on Route 66, was a single lottery ticket, Oklahoma Millions. And clipped to it with a rusted paperclip was a torn corner of newspaper, a small print announcement of winning numbers from a drawing that had happened, according to the date, 4 months earlier. I sat down right there on the concrete floor of the garage, my back against the workbench, and I checked the numbers against the ticket with my phone, the way you check something twice because your brain refuses to accept the first answer. Then I checked a third time. Then I sat very still and let the cold of the concrete seep through my jeans while the number on my phone screen and the number on the ticket sat there, identical, refusing to change no matter how many times I looked at them. $9,240,000. My husband had won the lottery 4 months earlier, and he had never said a word. I need to tell you what went through my mind in those first minutes, because it wasn't relief and it wasn't joy, even though those feelings would come later, in smaller doses, mixed with something harder to name. What went through my mind was a kind of cold arithmetic. For months, Walter had been sleeping beside me for 4 months, eating dinner across from me, complaining about a slow week at the shop, asking me how my patients were doing, all while knowing he was sitting on $9 million and choosing, deliberately, night after night, not to tell me. I thought about affairs. I'm not ashamed to admit that. I thought about secret accounts and secret plans and a version of my husband I didn't recognize, quietly building an exit from our marriage while I refilled his coffee mug every morning without knowing I was refilling the coffee mug of a man who might already be gone in every way that mattered. I put the ticket back exactly where I found it. I want to be honest with you about why. It wasn't because I intended to say nothing. It was because I needed time to think before I said anything, and some old nursing instinct in me, the part trained to stay calm in a crisis, told me that whatever I did next mattered enormously, and that panic would only make me sloppy. That evening, Walter came home at his usual time, 6:40, smelling like motor oil and the drive-through coffee he always got on the way home, even though we had a perfectly good coffee maker at the house. He kissed the top of my head the way he always did. He asked about my day. I told him about a patient of mine, an elderly woman named Ruth who'd been asking for her late husband all week, thinking he was still alive, and how I'd learned in hospice work that sometimes the kindest thing isn't correcting someone's confusion, but simply sitting with them inside it. Walter nodded and said that sounded hard, and meant it, and I looked at his face, tired, familiar, lined in exactly the places 19 years of squinting into engines had carved into it, and I thought, who are you? I didn't say anything that night. I lay awake beside him until nearly 2 a.m, listening to him breathe, running through everything I knew about our finances, every strange purchase, every late night at the shop, every moment over the past 4 months that I might have missed something. And the truth was, I hadn't missed anything, because there had been nothing to see. Whatever Walter was doing with $9 million, he was doing it so carefully that not one visible thing in our life had changed. The next morning, after he left for the shop, I did something I'm not proud of, though I'd do it again. I went through his desk in the small office we kept off the kitchen, the drawer where he filed insurance papers and tax documents and the occasional greeting card he'd forgotten to give me. I found nothing about the ticket itself, no claim paperwork, no bank statement showing a deposit, nothing that suggested he'd actually collected the money. Which meant, as far as I could tell, the ticket was still sitting there uncashed, for months into a claim window that I vaguely remembered, from some conversation years ago, having a deadline. That's when a new fear crept in, quieter and stranger than the fear of an affair. What if Walter hadn't told anyone, including himself, that he intended to claim it? What if some part of him was frozen, the same way his mother must have frozen at that kitchen table counting grocery money, and the ticket sitting in that coffee can wasn't a secret plan? It was a paralysis. I decided I needed information before I did anything else. I spent that Wednesday between patient visits doing something I'm slightly embarrassed to describe, sitting in my car in a Walgreens parking lot on my lunch break, searching on my phone for everything I could find about Oklahoma lottery claim deadlines, winner privacy laws, and what happens to unclaimed prizes. I learned that Oklahoma gave winners 180 days from the draw date to claim a prize, which meant Walter had roughly 2 months left before $9 million simply evaporated back into the state lottery fund. I learned that Oklahoma, unlike some states, did allow a claim to be made through certain trust structures that could shield a winner's identity from the initial public announcement, something I filed away without fully understanding yet why it mattered. I also learned, from an old newspaper archive I found while searching the exact draw date on the ticket, that the winning numbers had been drawn on a Saturday in June, the same weekend. I realized with a jolt that made my stomach drop that Dale Pruitt, Walter's business partner, had thrown a cookout at his place to celebrate the shop's 10th anniversary. I remembered that cookout. I remembered Walter being quieter than usual that evening, standing near the grill with a beer he barely touched, staring off toward the tree line behind Dale's property in a way I'd chalked up at the time to exhaustion. Something had happened that weekend. I didn't know what yet, but I could feel the shape of it the way you feel a storm coming before the sky actually changes color. A pressure, a stillness, the sense that the ordinary Tuesday I thought I was living inside had actually ended months ago without my knowledge. I need to tell you a little more about Earl Calloway, because I don't think you can understand the size of what Walter was carrying without understanding the shape of the man who built the fear inside him. Earl had died 11 years before any of this happened, of a heart attack in a Tulsa casino parking lot. Ironically enough, on a night he told Walter's mother he was working a late shift. Walter had been the one to identify the body. He was 36 years old at the time, already running the shop with Dale, already the kind of steady, dependable man his father had never managed to be, and I remember, at the funeral, watching Walter stand at the front of that small chapel and deliver a eulogy so careful and so generous that half the room cried harder than they had at any funeral in years, because everyone there understood exactly how much restraint it took for Walter to speak kindly about a man who had spent 30 years, teaching his family what it felt like to never fully trust the ground beneath them. Looking back, I believe the coffee can wasn't really about the money at all. It was about a promise Walter had made to himself as a 14-year-old boy working an after-school job to help keep the lights on. A promise that he would never again let anyone he loved feel that particular kind of ground-shifting fear, and somewhere in his exhausted, frightened calculations that October, he had convinced himself that the safest way to keep that promise was silence, even though silence was, in the end, its own kind of ground-shifting fear for me. I decided not to confront Walter immediately. This was, I think, the hardest decision of the entire ordeal, harder even than what came later, because every instinct in me wanted to walk into that garage, hold up the coffee can, and demand an explanation on the spot. But I have spent over 2 decades in hospice work learning one particular lesson over and over. People rarely tell you the truth when they're cornered. They tell you the truth when they feel safe enough to set down whatever they've been carrying. And I didn't yet know what Walter had been carrying, or why, or whether confronting him too soon might make him defensive in a way that would close a door I needed open. So instead, for the next 4 days I watched. I watched the way he ate dinner, a little slower than usual, like each bite required consideration. I watched the way he checked his phone at the kitchen table, not obsessively, but with a kind of held breath every time it buzzed. I watched him on Thursday evening standing at the kitchen window after the dishes were done, looking out at nothing, his jaw working the way it did when he was chewing on something he didn't know how to say out loud. On Friday night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait for him to come to me, because I understood, watching him, that he might never come to me on his own. Whatever weight he was carrying, he had apparently decided he was carrying it alone, the same way his mother had once carried her fear alone at that same kind of kitchen table, and I refused to let that particular inheritance pass one more day unchallenged in my house. I waited until the boys had both called for their Sunday check-ins, until the dishes were done and Biscuit, our aging orange tabby, had settled into his spot on the arm of the couch. I sat down across from Walter at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd once watched him propose with a ring he bought on a payment plan he was too proud to admit to for nearly a year, and I set the coffee can down between us. I watched his face when he saw it. I want you to understand, because I think about this moment more than almost any other moment in my life, that what crossed his face wasn't guilt exactly, and it wasn't relief either. It was something closer to grief, as if the can itself was a small coffin he'd been avoiding looking at. "Walter," I said, "I need you to tell me what this is." He didn't ask how I'd found it. He didn't try to explain it away. He just sat there for a long moment with his hands flat on the table, and then he told me everything, in a voice so quiet I had to lean forward to catch some of it. He had bought the ticket on impulse at a gas station off Route 66 on his way home from Dale's cookout, the same night I'd noticed him standing quietly by the grill. He told me that earlier that same afternoon, before the cookout, Dale had pulled him aside in the shop's back office and told him, casually, almost cheerfully, that the business's line of credit had been quietly maxed out for months, that certain supplier payments had been delayed, and that a piece of diagnostic equipment Dale claimed to have purchased for the shop 3 years ago didn't actually seem to exist anywhere Walter could find it. Walter told me he'd spent the rest of that cookout smiling and nodding at people while doing silent math in his head about how close they were to losing everything he'd spent 17 years building. He said he bought the ticket almost as a joke, a bitter, self-mocking little gesture, the kind of thing his father might have done, and that was exactly why the guilt hit him so hard 4 days later when he checked the numbers alone in the shop's back office after everyone else had gone home and realized he was holding a winning ticket worth more money than he'd ever imagined touching in his life. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said, and his voice cracked in a way I had heard perhaps twice in 19 years of marriage. Every time I opened my mouth to say it, all I could hear was my dad's voice, and all I could see was my mom's face at that kitchen table, and I thought, if I say this out loud, if I make it real, I become him. I become the man who gambles, and then has to explain himself. "But Walter," I said, and I was crying by then, though I hadn't noticed it starting, "you didn't gamble our future. You found a way to save it. Why does that feel like shame to you instead of a gift?" He didn't have an answer for that. Not yet. But something in his face loosened slightly, like a knot that had been pulled tight for 4 months, finally getting enough slack to breathe around. We sat at that table until almost 1 in the morning. He told me about the fear underneath the shame, the fear that if he told me, I'd want him to claim it immediately and publicly, the way most winners do, and that once it was public, Dale would know, and if Dale knew about the money before Walter had proof of what Dale had actually done with the missing equipment funds, Dale would find a way to make sure none of it stuck to him. Walter had been trying, in his quiet, methodical way, the same way he diagnosed a stubborn engine problem, one component at a time, to gather enough documentation about the shop's finances before he did anything that might tip Dale off that trouble was coming. It wasn't an excuse. I told him that plainly, that night, and he agreed with me. But it was, I came to understand, a reason, and there is a difference between the two. A reason doesn't erase the hurt. It just helps you understand where the hurt came from, so you can decide what to do with it instead of simply drowning in it. By the time we finally went to bed that night, we had made 2 decisions together. The first was that we were going to claim this prize the right way, carefully, with proper legal protection, the way people who intend to keep both their money and their sanity are supposed to do it. The second was that we were going to find out exactly what Dale Pruitt had been doing with Calloway and Pruitt's money, because Walter's suspicion, sharpened now by 4 months of quiet dread, had hardened into something closer to certainty. The following Monday, I took a half day from the agency and we drove together to a small law firm in downtown Tulsa that specialized in estate planning and asset protection, a firm Walter had actually researched weeks earlier, in secret, the same careful research habit he brought to every engine he'd ever rebuilt. The attorney we met with was a sharp, soft-spoken woman named Priya Anand, who listened to the entire story, the ticket, the deadline closing in, the business partner, without a flicker of judgment crossing her face. "You have about 8 weeks left before this claim window closes," she told us. "That's enough time to do this properly, but only if we move deliberately, starting now. My recommendation is a revocable trust as the claiming entity. Oklahoma allows certain trusts to claim on behalf of an anonymous beneficiary, which keeps your names out of the initial public record. Given what you've described about your business partner, I'd say that protection isn't optional. It's essential." We spent nearly 3 hours in her office that day, building the outline of what would become the Sooner Sunrise Trust, a name we chose specifically because it was unremarkable, the kind of name that wouldn't draw a second glance on any public document. Walter would be named as the sole grantor, I would be named alongside him as co-beneficiary, and an independent trustee, a colleague of Priya's, would appear on all filings that required a name at all. Priya also gave us the name of a forensic accountant she'd worked with before, a careful, unhurried man named Frank Delgado, who specialized in exactly the kind of quiet financial excavation Walter needed done at the shop before Dale had any reason to suspect anyone was looking. I want to pause here and tell you something I've thought about often since all of this happened. There's a very particular kind of exhaustion that comes from fighting 2 battles at once, one to protect something you've gained, and one to expose something that was taken from you, while trying, at the same time, to hold together the ordinary fabric of your life: dinners, phone calls with your grown sons, a cat who still needs to be fed on schedule regardless of how large the numbers in your bank account might soon become. Walter and I learned quickly that we couldn't do both battles at full volume simultaneously. We had to choose, in any given week, which one needed our sharpest attention, and trust that the other could wait a little without falling apart. Frank Delgado began quietly reviewing the shop's books the following week, working evenings after the shop closed, going through supplier invoices and equipment purchase records with the patient thoroughness of a man who clearly loved untangling exactly this kind of mess. Within 10 days, he found what Walter had already suspected. The diagnostic equipment Dale claimed to have purchased 3 years earlier, an $11,000 engine analyzer, had never actually been delivered to the shop. The invoice existed. The payment existed, routed through the business account with Dale's approval. But the equipment itself existed nowhere, not in the shop's inventory, not in any service record, not anywhere Frank could find a trace of it. Digging further, cross-referencing supplier names against Oklahoma's business registry, the way I'd once cross-referenced medications against a patient's chart, Frank found that the supplier listed on that invoice, a company called Precision Diagnostic Solutions, had been registered 18 months before the purchase to an address that turned out, when Walter drove past it on a Saturday morning under the excuse of running errands, to be a self-storage facility on the edge of town, not an office, not a warehouse, just a bank of orange roll-up doors with no signage indicating any business operated there at all. The registered agent on that company's paperwork was a woman named Carla Pruitt, Dale's wife. I remember the exact moment Walter told me that detail, standing in our kitchen with Frank's report spread across the table, and I felt the same cold clarity I imagine you feel watching this if you've ever discovered that a suspicion you've been quietly nursing turned out to be entirely, devastatingly correct. It wasn't triumph. It was something quieter and heavier, the particular weight of learning that a person you trusted enough to build a life's work alongside had been slowly, deliberately, taking pieces of that life away from you for years, not months, years, because Frank's deeper dig eventually turned up 2 more phantom invoices stretching back to nearly 4 years earlier. totaling just over $91,000 in payments to companies that existed only on paper. Walter didn't confront Dale immediately. This surprised me a little, given how quickly he'd wanted to act in the early days after I found the ticket, but I think something about watching me choose patience over panic with the coffee can have taught him something about the value of moving carefully. Instead, on Priya's advice, we compiled everything Frank had found into a clean, dated file and handed it to a white-collar fraud attorney she recommended, a measured, unhurried man named Ronald Weiss, who reviewed it over the course of a week and then told us, plainly, that we had more than enough for both a civil claim and a criminal referral, and that the smartest move was to let the shop's outside accountant, technically still an independent third party with no reason to suspect anything unusual, formally trigger a routine annual audit that would surface the same findings through channels that couldn't be traced back to Walter alone. While all of that was quietly grinding forward through the fall, the other front of my life had already begun heating up in ways I hadn't anticipated. It started, as these things so often seem to, with a phone call from my sister-in-law, Bonnie, Walter's younger sister, who lived 2 hours away in Bartlesville and who had never, in 19 years, called me directly without going through Walter first. She called on a Tuesday evening in November, her voice pitched into a warmth that immediately put me on alert, the way a smell can warn you of smoke before you ever see flame. "Renee, I've just been thinking about you and Walter so much lately," Bonnie said. "I don't know why, just a feeling. Is everything all right over there?" I told her everything was fine and asked what had prompted the feeling, and she laughed a little too quickly and said it was nothing, just sister's intuition. But 3 days later, my own brother, Curtis, who lived in Springfield, Missouri, and who I spoke to maybe 4 times a year, called me out of the blue as well, asking almost the exact same question in almost the exact same tone, and it took me until that second call to understand what was happening. Someone had heard something. Someone had connected the dots between an unclaimed $9 million Oklahoma Millions ticket and a small auto shop off Sheridan Road. And word, in the particular way word travels through families that aren't as private as they like to believe, had started to move. I later learned, through a slip Bonnie made months afterward, that it had come from Dale's wife, Carla, of all people, who had mentioned to a mutual acquaintance at church that Walter had been acting strange since June, distracted, distant, and that she wondered if there was money trouble at the shop. That offhand comment, filtered through 2 or 3 more conversations, had somehow transformed by the time it reached Bonnie into a rumor that Walter had come into a large, unexplained sum of money. The details were wrong. The instinct behind them was not. Once that first thread had been pulled, the family attention arrived in waves, each one dressed up as concern. Bonnie sent a fruit basket that November with a card that read, simply, "Thinking of you both. Family is everything." And I stood in my kitchen holding that basket the way I imagine you'd hold something you weren't sure was a gift or a test. Curtis called again the following week, this time working in, almost as an aside, a mention of a friend of his who did wealth management and would be happy to have a conversation, no pressure, just in case Walter and I were thinking about our future. Walter's mother, who had softened considerably in her later years, but who still carried the particular vigilance of a woman who had once watched her husband gamble away a house, called and asked, gently but pointedly, whether Walter had been to a casino recently, whether everything at the shop was truly stable, whether we needed anything. I understood, listening to her, that her worry was genuine, rooted in old fear rather than new greed, and that made it harder to hold at a distance than Bonnie's or Curtis's more calculated warmth. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, in late November, I finally reached a point where I needed someone who simply knew, not to advise me, since Priya and Frank and Ronald were already handling every practical angle with more precision than I could have managed alone, but just to sit across from me and let me say the whole impossible shape of it out loud to another human being who loved me and had no stake in any outcome. I called my closest friend, a retired middle school counselor named Odessa Marsh, who I'd known since our sons played Pop Warner football together 15 years earlier. Odessa was, without question, the most discreet person I'd ever met, not secretive, discreet, the kind of woman who understood instinctively that some things belong only to the people they concern, and who had spent 30 years listening to teenagers' worst secrets without ever once letting one slip. We met at a quiet diner near her house on a Thursday evening, the kind of place with vinyl booths and a pie case by the register, and I told her everything over 2 cups of coffee that went cold before either of us finished them, the coffee can, the 4 months of silence, Earl Calloway's ghost sitting at our kitchen table, Dale's phantom invoices, the fruit basket, Curtis and his business card. Odessa listened without interrupting once, her hands wrapped around her mug, her eyes steady on mine the whole time. When I finally finished, she was quiet for a long moment. "Are you sleeping?" she asked me. "Better than I expected to be," I told her. "Is Walter still talking to you? Really talking, not just explaining?" "Yes," I said, and I realized, saying it out loud, that it was true. She nodded slowly and reached across the table to squeeze my hand. "Then you're not in the crisis anymore, Renee. You're just in the hard, slow part of healing something, and that part doesn't need saving. It just needs someone to sit across from you every now and then and remind you that you're not losing your mind." She smiled. "You're not losing your mind." I believed her. And I want to tell you, if you're watching this and carrying something similarly enormous and unspoken in your own life, that having one person who simply knows, who asks nothing of you except honesty, can be the difference between drowning quietly and staying afloat long enough to actually fix what's broken. By early December, the pressure had a shape and a rhythm to it. Calls, cards, casual visits that weren't quite casual, each one landing with the same quiet suggestion underneath the pleasantries. We know something is different, and we want to be included before whatever it is becomes something we can't get close to. I began keeping my own small record of it, not because I intended to weaponize it, but because Priya had told us early on that documentation of coordinated financial pressure could matter later if any of it escalated, and because writing things down had always been, for me, a way of turning panic into something manageable, a habit I'd carried since nursing school. When I'd learned that a clear chart could save you from your own racing mind in a crisis. The claim deadline was approaching fast now, and Priya, Frank, and Ronald were all working in parallel, one securing the trust structure, one finishing the financial excavation at the shop, one preparing the fraud referral, and Walter and I found ourselves living 2 lives at once. The visible one, dinners, work, Sunday calls with our sons, and the invisible one, late-night calls with lawyers, a growing folder of documents kept in a locked drawer, a coffee can that had been moved, finally out of the garage and into a safe deposit box at a bank branch on the other side of town where no one we knew would think to look for us. We claimed the prize in the 2nd week of December, 6 weeks before the deadline would have closed. The sooner sunrise, Trust filed the paperwork through Priya's office. Walter's name, my name, neither appeared anywhere in the public announcement, which stated only that a trust entity had claimed the prize. No photograph, no interview, no hometown mentioned. After taxes and the lump sum election, the amount that actually landed in the trust account came to just over $6.1 million, a number so large it took me nearly a week before I could look at it on a screen without my hands going cold. We kept working. That was the strangest part, I think, for anyone who hasn't lived through something like this. Walter still opened the shop most mornings. I still drove to Ruth's house and sat with her while she asked, again and again, whether her husband was coming home for dinner, and I still told her, gently, that he was resting and that she should rest too, because some kindnesses don't change no matter how much money sits quietly in a trust across town. 2 weeks after the claim went through, the shop's outside accountant, as arranged, initiated the annual audit. Dale, Walter told me later, had seemed almost relaxed about it initially, joking that the accountant was more thorough than the IRS itself, until the audit reached the equipment purchase records and the phantom supplier invoices, at which point, according to Walter, Dale's mood shifted so visibly that even the front desk receptionist noticed and asked Walter privately if everything was all right. The audit's findings went, as planned, to Ronald Weiss, who coordinated with local authorities. In January, Dale Pruitt was formally confronted by the shop's accountant and legal counsel in a meeting Walter chose, deliberately, not to attend on Priya's advice, so that nothing about the timing could later be framed as personal retaliation rather than a legitimate business finding. 3 days before that meeting, something happened that neither of us had anticipated. Walter found a plain white envelope tucked under the wiper blade of his truck in the shop's parking lot. No name, no postage, just a single folded index card inside, typed rather than handwritten. It read, "Walk away from the audit, and none of this needs to get complicated for either of us. You have more to protect than I do now." Walter called me from the parking lot before he'd even gotten in his truck, his voice tight in a way I'd only heard once before, the night of the coffee can. We photographed the card and the envelope exactly as they were, sealed them in a plastic bag, and Ronald advised us to file a report with the Tulsa Police Department that same afternoon, not to escalate anything ourselves, simply to create a documented record in case the pressure continued. It didn't happen again, but I think about that index card often, the particular ugliness of a man who had already taken $91,000 trying, in his final hours of leverage, to take something else as well, our silence, our fear, the same currency he'd apparently been counting on for years. Dale did not deny it once the paper trail was laid out in full. He resigned from the business within the week, and the matter was referred to the Tulsa County District Attorney's Office for review of possible embezzlement charges. I won't pretend the aftermath was clean or simple. Carla Pruitt called our house twice in February, first in anger, accusing Walter of destroying her family over what she called an honest bookkeeping disagreement, and then, a week later, in a much smaller voice, asking whether there was any way this could be settled quietly, privately, without involving the DA's office at all. Walter told her, kindly but firmly, that the matter was no longer his to settle, that it belonged to the accountants and the lawyers now, and that he wished her family well, which was true, even if it didn't feel like enough. Around that same time, the family pressure on our end reached its own strange peak. Bonnie drove the 2 hours from Bartlesville unannounced on a Saturday in late February, texting from the highway that she was already halfway there and wanted to bring lunch, the exact kind of short-notice arrival that leaves you no real room to say no gracefully. She arrived with a bag of takeout from a barbecue place Walter had always loved, and for the first 20 minutes at our kitchen table, she was simply his sister, warm, funny, asking about the boys, about the shop, about nothing in particular. Then, setting down her fork, she said, "Walter, I love you, and I'm just going to say this because somebody in this family needs to. I know something's different. I don't need details. I just don't want you shutting the people who love you out of it, especially not after everything Dad put this family through. We're supposed to be the ones who do it differently." It was, I'll admit, a well-aimed line, invoking the exact old wound Walter had spent 4 months trying to protect himself from. But something had shifted in him since that Friday night at the kitchen table with the coffee can between us. He looked at his sister steadily and said, "Bonnie, we are doing it differently. That's exactly why I'm not going to sit here and let anyone, including you, pressure me into decisions about money I haven't chosen to make yet. When there's something real to share, you'll be the first to know, but it'll be on our terms, not because a fruit basket and a barbecue lunch talked us into it." Bonnie's face went through several expressions in quick succession, hurt, then something more searching, and finally, to my genuine surprise, something like respect. She stayed another hour, the conversation easier after that, and when she left, she hugged us both at the door, and the hug felt, for the first time in months, entirely uncomplicated. Curtis was less easily settled. In March, He showed up at the shop directly, catching Walter during a slow afternoon, bringing along, in what Walter described afterward as one of the more transparent maneuvers he'd ever witnessed, his wealth management friend, a smiling, overly familiar man named Greg, who handed Walter a business card before either of them had said a full sentence to him. Walter, by then well practiced in the particular art of polite, immovable refusal, thanked Greg for his time, told Curtis he already had a financial team he trusted completely, and walked them both back out to the parking lot within 15 minutes. I called Curtis myself that evening, and we had, for the first time in years, an honest conversation rather than a cheerful, surface-level one. I told him I loved him, that I understood some of what was driving his behavior, old worries about our aging parents' care, his own shaky finances after a rough divorce 2 years earlier, and that none of that made it acceptable to show up at Walter's workplace with a stranger's business card in hand. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he apologized, and it was, I believed, at least mostly sincere. There was one more moment that spring, though, that I think deserves telling in full, because it was the closest thing we had to a single decisive confrontation, the moment everything else had been building toward without my quite realizing it. Walter's mother hosted an early Mother's Day lunch that May, the first full family gathering since the rumors had started the previous fall, and both Bonnie and Curtis, who barely knew each other and had certainly never coordinated anything in their lives before that spring, ended up seated directly across the table from us, close enough that the conversation had nowhere to hide. It started innocently, questions about the boys, about the shop's sale to Julio, about whether Walter's mother liked her new smaller house. But about 20 minutes in, Bonnie set down her fork in a way that felt deliberate and said, gently but pointedly, that she thought it was time the family talked openly about whatever had been going on all these months, since everyone at the table clearly already suspected something. Curtis, to my surprise, nodded along almost immediately, as though the two of them actually had spoken beforehand after all. I felt Walter go still beside me. I reached over and put my hand on his knee under the table, a small signal we'd worked out during our counseling sessions that meant, I've got this one, let me start. I appreciate that you both care, I said, keeping my voice level, the same voice I used with frightened patients' families at 2 a.m. And I know some of what's driven the questions this year, worry about Mom's care, Curtis, and old fear left over from Earl, Bonnie. I understand both of those things, genuinely. But I need you to hear me, clearly. Whatever has or hasn't changed in our lives this year is going to be shared with this family on our terms, when we're ready, not because a series of visits and phone calls and business cards eventually wore us down. That's not how trust works, and honestly, it's not how family is supposed to work either. The table went quiet. Walter's mother, who I hadn't realized had been listening as closely as she had, set down her own fork and said, in a voice much steadier than I expected, that she agreed completely, that she'd spent 30 years of her own marriage learning exactly how corrosive it was to have people circling a family's private business under the banner of concern, and that she, of all people at that table, understood better than anyone why Walter might need time before opening a door all the way. Curtis looked down at his plate for a long moment, and then, quietly, apologized, not just for the business card in the parking lot, but for the pattern underneath it, admitting, haltingly, that his own finances had been shakier since his divorce than he'd let on to anyone, and that fear about his own future had made him grab at whatever seemed like an opening. Bonnie's apology came less easily, more defensively at first, but by the time the lunch ended, something real had shifted at that table, not resolution exactly, but the beginning of an honesty that hadn't existed there before. By April, the criminal referral against Dale Pruitt had moved forward, with the DA's office filing formal embezzlement charges covering the 4 years of phantom invoices Frank Delgado had uncovered. Walter was asked to give a statement, which he did, calmly and factually, the way he'd once diagnosed a failing transmission, cause, evidence, conclusion, nothing more, nothing less. Dale's case is still moving through the courts as I record this, and I try not to follow it too closely, the way Priya once advised us, because there's a particular kind of peace that comes from handing something to the right process and then stepping back to let it run. What I want to tell you about, more than any of that, is what the months after the money actually did to our marriage, because I think that's the part people are always most curious about and least often told honestly. Walter and I went to see a counselor together that spring, not because our marriage was in crisis exactly, but because I told him, one night in March, that I needed to understand more fully why the shame around his father's gambling had grown so large inside him that it had made him choose 4 months of silence over 4 minutes of an uncomfortable conversation with his own wife. We went for 11 sessions. I learned things about Walter's childhood I hadn't fully understood in 19 years of marriage. The specific night his mother had once packed a single suitcase and gotten as far as the end of their street before turning around. The year Walter had quietly started working an after-school job at 14, not for spending money, but because he'd overheard his parents discussing whether they could keep the lights on. He learned things about me, too, about the particular fear I'd carried since finding that coffee can. Not the fear of losing money, but the fear of discovering that I had built a life alongside a man whose deepest instinct, under real pressure, was to disappear inward rather than reach toward me. We came out the other side of those 11 sessions closer, I think, than we had been in years. Not because the money brought us closer, but because the crisis forced a kind of honesty neither of us had ever quite required of the other before. In May, we finally told our sons the full story, sitting them both down together over a dinner Walter cooked himself, the same brisket recipe he made every 4th of July. Aidan laughed so hard at one point that he had to leave the table. Cole, always the more careful of the two, asked a dozen practical questions about the trust structure before he ever asked how we were feeling, which made both Walter and me laugh, because it was such a perfectly Cole response. We set aside a portion of the trust for each of them, not extravagant, but meaningful, earmarked for whatever they needed when they needed it, a down payment, a career shift, a rainy day neither of them could yet imagine. We did not give money to Bonnie or Curtis, not out of lingering resentment, but because Priya had helped us understand something important during those early weeks. Giving money in response to pressure teaches the person applying the pressure that the pressure worked. What we offered instead, once the dust settled, was something I think mattered more in the long run. Honest relationships, rebuilt slowly, on terms we chose rather than terms extracted from us in a moment of vulnerability. Walter sold his half of Callaway and Pruitt that summer to a young mechanic named Julio who'd worked under him for 6 years and who Walter trusted completely, financing part of the sale himself, so Julio could take it over without drowning in debt. Walter still goes in 2 mornings a week now, not because he has to, but because, as he told me once, standing in that same garage where I'd once found the coffee can, some kinds of work aren't really about the money at all. We used part of the trust to pay off our mortgage and to help Walter's mother move into a smaller, easier home closer to us, a decision that softened something in Walter I hadn't seen soften in years, watching him finally be able to give his mother the kind of quiet security she'd never fully had during his childhood. We kept our brick ranch house in Kendall Whittier, the one with the squeaky porch swing, because neither of us wanted a bigger house nearly as much as we wanted to keep the life we'd built inside that particular set of walls. A year after I found that coffee can, I was sitting on our porch on a warm evening in October, the swing squeaking under me the exact way it always had, watching Walter grill something in the backyard while Biscuit dozed in a patch of fading sunlight on the porch rail. Dale's case had been resolved with a plea agreement that spring, restitution, and a suspended sentence, and I'd felt, hearing the news, not triumph exactly, but a kind of settled quiet, the particular satisfaction of watching a difficult truth finally land where it belonged. Bonnie had visited twice more since that barbecue lunch, both times without an agenda beyond simply being family, and Curtis had started, slowly, rebuilding something more honest with both of us, one careful phone call at a time. I still work at the hospice agency, though I've cut back to part-time now, because I discovered something in the middle of all of this that surprised me. I didn't actually want to stop the work that had shaped who I was for 23 years. I only wanted the freedom to do less of it, and to be more present for the parts of my life the money could never touch anyway. Sunday dinners, the particular sound of my husband's truck pulling into the driveway, the ordinary, unremarkable rhythm of a marriage that had somehow, against every fear I'd carried in those first 11 minutes on the garage floor, come out stronger on the other side of its worst-kept secret. Ruth passed away that following January, peacefully, in her sleep, with her daughter beside her, and I was there that final week, sitting with her the same way I always had, holding her hand while she asked once more, faintly, whether her husband was on his way home. I told her he was close, that he loved her, and I meant every word of it, because I had learned, long before any of this started, that some truths matter more than accuracy, and some kindnesses cost nothing but your willingness to sit inside someone else's confusion instead of correcting it. I think about Ruth often now, about how much of my life, before the coffee can and after it, has been shaped by learning to sit calmly inside uncertainty until the truth finally becomes clear enough to hold. Walter still keeps a coffee can in the garage. It's a new one now, empty, sitting on a shelf where I can see it every time I walk in to grab a tool, and neither of us has ever quite explained to the other why we wanted to keep it there. I think we both understand it without needing the words. It's not a symbol of what he hid from me anymore. It's a reminder of what it cost us to finally stop hiding things from each other, and what we built, deliberately, on the other side of that particular kind of honesty. What would you have done if you'd opened your husband's toolbox looking for a wrench and found 9 million reasons to wonder who you'd actually married? Would you have confronted him on the spot, or would you have done what I did and waited quietly until you understood the whole truth before deciding what to do with it?